Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon, trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
In Betty Davis's fabulous film All About Eve, she has a great line. Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Well, we're going to have a bit of a bumpy ride right now with an absolute great guest and a storyteller. He was born in Toronto at the Salvation Army Hospital. He was abandoned as a kid. You were on the streets at 6. You ran into trouble with the law. You dropped out of high school at 15. You ran away to the States at 17 to become a professional gambler of all things. You were deported twice. 30 years later, you're dubbed the Godfather of reality TV as creator, producer, and co-host of the NBC hit Real People. You were a successful stand-up comic and for 4 years, Frank Sinatra's private writer. I wonder how private. And the only one to whom Jim Garrison, the New Orleans DA depicted in the movie JFK, told his story to, now in 2 definitive award-winning films. Now, your story is in a 5-star rated book. Your Mother's Not a Virgin. He's on his way back to Canada now for a 3-week book tour starting September 22nd right here in Vancouver. And I'm delighted we have him here first from Las Vegas, John Barbour. Welcome to the Goddard Report.
Oh, Jim, thank you so much. I love the introduction, and thank you. And I must tell you quite honestly that all these magnificent things that happened to me happened by accident, truthfully, and all the terrible things in my life were those things that were absolutely well planned. And I am so delighted to be talking to you before I come to Vancouver, because I'm coming to Vancouver, which to me is by far not only the most beautiful city in North America, but probably the most beautiful city in the world. And back in the mid-90s, I did a delightful show there for 6 months. It was called The Liars Club. I hosted the show. I was one of the panelists, and my co-panelist was Shannon Tweed, who at the time was chasing Gene Simmons, the guy from Kiss, to get married because she had his child, and she eventually succeeded. And I must tell you, when I left Hollywood in the mid-90s also, I wanted to move to Vancouver. I desperately wanted to move there, but my son was becoming a writer in Hollywood, and it was just too far from my son. But I can't tell you, I'm going to spend a week there, and I'm going to absolutely love it. And also, my sister lives on Vancouver Island in Victoria, and when I left and ran away from home when I was 17 years of age to come to the States, I had deleted my entire family. That was my sister, and that was my stepbrother, and, of course, my mother, whom I never saw anyway, and my father, who had deserted us in 1939. I came from a severely dysfunctional home in Toronto, and my father joined the Canadian Army to get away to the peace and quiet of World War II. So, again, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm delighted and honored to be here.
John, could you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Well, you mentioned I was born in the Salvation Army Hospital, and I was an unplanned and unwanted child, and I didn't know how unwanted I was until I was born. For a while, I thought my name was That's Enough and not John. But I do not remember my mother at all until I was 6 years of age, when my father went off to join the Canadian Army to go, as I said, to the peace and quiet of World War II. And what happened is that uncles came into my life like grapes. They came in bunches, just bunches and bunches of uncles, and most of them came to booze with my mother, or bed with my mother, or batter with my mother. And so I spent most of my time out on the streets. My dream, of course, as a kid in Toronto, there were only 6 teams in the NHL, was to be a professional hockey player. So I spent a lot of my time at St. John's Reformatory, not as somebody who was imprisoned there, but they had the best rinks there. So I spent most of my time there, and most of my time in the Manor Theater, where for 5 cents on Kingston Road I could see double features, and I fell in love with Frank Capra movies and Jimmy Stewart. And at the end of every film, it said made in Hollywood. So I decided that as a youngster, maybe that's where I wanted to go. And the thing that kept me alive, we were talking about this briefly before we started the show, was when I listened to the radio, I listened to the great voice of Lorne Greene, who had this Orson Welles voice, and he would tell stories. And I would be transfixed by those stories. And also, as a kid, I got Gordon Sinclair's books. And I don't know if anybody remembers Gordon Sinclair, but he wrote these wonderful short stories about real people. So I used to read them to the class. And I spent, when I wasn't in a theater or on a rink, I spent most of my time at the library. And from the ages of like 15 to 17, I got involved, when you come from a broken home, as I did, and I guess most people who come from a broken home can identify with this, you're looking to get attention. And you don't usually get attention by doing good things. You get attention by doing awful things. And I did a lot of awful things that got me arrested by the police, just terrible things that I did with my friend Mel. Mel Nixon was his name, and if Neil Simon wrote a Junior Sunshine Boys, it would have been about me and Mel as kids. And I spent from the time 15 to 17, Jim, gambling. And I would gamble with older people. The oldest was, I guess, around 40, but there were about 8 of us every weekend. I lost everything I could steal or earn, which was often quite a bit. And then I realized after a year, Jim, I wasn't trying to make any money. I was trying to make friends. And I would be the first to lose money, and I'd always be the last to leave. And so I decided, if I'm going to do this, I better learn to do it properly. So I went to the library on Main Street, which was right across from the police station, by the way, which I frequented often, not as an invitee, but somebody who was dragged there. But I got 2 books. One was called Scarny and Dice and Scarny and Cards. And I learned to gamble. And I don't know if I have a photographic memory or not, but if I read something, it sticks with me. So I realized if I was going to play poker, I didn't have to be in every hand. And over a period of about 2 months, this 16-year-old kid won $700, and that was me. Now, at the time, I was in the 1st grade at Malvern Collegiate, and I was on my way to school to take a final exam to go on into the 2nd year, and my mother stopped me on the way out the door, and she said, well, you know now for sure your father's not coming home. And she read this letter to me from Scotland, where he said he was never coming home again, and he was discarding his family. In essence, he was going to stay in England. Well, I was totally heartbroken, because the only one I really had any affection for as a youngster was my father. So when I went to school, and they handed us the algebra tests and the English test and the social studies test. They used to have social studies in school, as I wrote down a big 0 on every one of the pages and walked out of school and decided I was going to go to the United States. It was so sad I'll tell you this one last little story. I was 12 years of age, and it got so bad in my house. One of the uncles, his name was Garth, and my mother had given me a real bow and arrow set for Christmas. Now, what is a 12-year-old going to do with a real bow and arrow set? Except she knew I liked Errol Flynn in the movie Robin Hood. And anyway, Garth was half undressed in the house on Christmas morning with my mother on the sofa, and they were drinking beer, and he grabbed the bow and arrow, and he wanted to try it out on me. And he chased me around the house, shooting a real arrow at me, almost killing me. And I ran out of the house, and I ran to the railroad tracks where I used to hang out a lot, and I stayed in a boxcar for 2 days, and it was the happiest 2 days and most peaceful days of my life. But when I left there, instead of coming home, I went to my friend's house. His name was Don Lee. He came from the only happy family that I knew. They were at Scarborough Road and Kingston Road, and they lived right across from a Baptist church, and I think that's why they moved there. And I had asked the mother if she would adopt me. And she said, "No, we can't adopt you. You have a mother." And I said, "Well, no, she's in Buffalo right now with one of my uncles. You want to come home and I can prove it to you?" I was even sort of a smart-mouthed kid as a kid. As a matter of fact, one sidebar story, in the 8th grade, you must remember, Jim, there were no fat people when I was younger. I don't know if you remember that. But we did have one fat, mean teacher. His name was Hetherington in the 8th grade. He was so heavy, he had to have a special chair made. But because of this, he had an immensely mean disposition, and he used to verbally abuse and sometimes physically abuse the kids because they allowed corporal punishment in those days. And he always started the class by complaining about something. And one day he sat down in the chair and he said, "Oh, my ankles are all swollen." And I said, out loud, I thought I was whispering, I said, "How can you tell?" Well, the class up, they laughed so loud, and he leaped up and he stumbled down after me and dragged me into the principal's office. And they would let you really strap kids hard, and I got strapped hard an awful lot. So, in any event, Mrs. Lee gave me a Bible, and she said, "I want you to come to church with me." So I read the Bible. I memorized the Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelations, and I prayed every night. And they used to have a prayer break at church, and it was a really nice touch. In the middle of the sermon, the minister would stop and say, "Now it's time for your own private prayer." And of course, I always prayed that my father would be home, and I would rush home afterwards. I wouldn't even stop with the Lees for lunch, looking for my father, and he was never there. So the 13th week, in the middle of the sermon, when he said it's prayer break, I just got up and I left, and I went outside, and everybody watched me leave, and I sat on the steps. Jim, the minister, saw me. As soon as the service was over, he came out, and he put his hand on my shoulder. I almost cried, Jim, because it was the first time anybody had touched me. And he said, "Are you all right, John?" And I said, "Sir, you know, this is not for me." He said, "What's not for you?" I said, "This prayer business is not for me. It's not working." He said, "What do you mean it's not working?" "I pray in the church where God should be listening to me, and I pray at home, and I try not to pray when I'm on the bed because I went to bed and I didn't want him to think that I was being disrespectful, so I would wait for my prayers to be said here, and it's just not working, so I'm not going to do it anymore." And he said to me, "Well, you must understand God's will." And I don't know where it came from, Jim. I looked up at him and I said, "Sir, I don't think I'm in it." Well, everybody around me laughed. And that sort of became, I don't know where this came from, sort of like a defense mechanism, this sense of humor. And from that point on, I sort of became a non-believer, even though I will tell you quite honestly, there must have been a great deal of divine intervention in my life because I never really planned any of the wonderful things that I got They all seemed to come about all by accident, just because I wanted to get into the United States and have a new life, and so I entered illegally. And I was on my way on a train. I took it to Las Vegas because, as you said, I want to be a professional gambler. And if you look at the cover of my book, you see me dressed in this very expensive blue suit, and I'm wearing a Stetson. It looked like I'm 25. I'm only 17 years of age, but on the way to Las Vegas, the train has an accident. Well, I'm guilty. I think the Immigration Service has called forward and said, you better stop this train and get that kid, John Barbour, off the train. So I left the train, and I got on the bus, and the nearest place I could get was to Lake Tahoe. The bus stopped in front of a place called the Calneva Lodge. God, it was beautiful, Jim. I walked inside, and it was like a set of an MGM musical. I expected to see Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. I walked around for a half an hour, then I started to gamble. And I was at the crap table with my back to the front door. And people started to look. I thought they were looking at me because I was doing pretty well. But soon the dealers stopped, and then people sitting at the bar stopped, and I realized they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me. So I turned around, and who should walk in the front door? Frank Sinatra, with his overcoat draped over his shoulders like an Italian Superman. He was arm in arm with Sam Giancana, who was the mafia chieftain of Chicago, and I had just read a front-page story of him on the train coming down, and there were 3 Italian Praetorian guards there. They're bodyguards, and I couldn't believe it, because a week earlier, I had seen him in this film that you must remember. I believe it's called As Time Goes By. It's a Jerome Kern story, and Jerome Kern wrote the lyrics to Showboat, and Sinatra's in a white tuxedo, standing on a white platform, and he's singing Old Man River. And now it's a week later, and he's walking right past me. And then less than 20 years later, I ended up accidentally being his private right.
We'll have more with John Barbour right after this.
Engineer Gold Mines is focused on the exploration and development of the historic high-grade Engineer Gold Mine situated 32 kilometers southwest of Atlin, British Columbia. Engineer Gold Mines is fully permitted for surface and underground exploration with the 2019 drill program now underway. Engineer Gold Mines Limited trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol EAU. For more information, please visit us at engineergoldmines.com.
Grand Portage Resources' Herbert Gold Project in southeast Alaska highlights increased gold resource, indicated and inferred, of 860,000 ounces, in excess of 10 grams per ton gold. Expansion drilling is planned on the Herbert Gold property for the summer of 2019. Grand Portage Resources trading symbols are GPG on the TSX Venture, GPTRF on the OTCQB, and GPB on Frankfurt. For more information, please visit our website, grandportage.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Barbour. John, what kind of jobs did you have at first? And if it's not too sensitive, could you tell us about your first deportation from the U.S.?
Oh gosh, what a terrific question. When I decided, I gave up gambling for one reason. I was after I left Lake Tahoe, I went to Las Vegas where I got a room, and I would spend an hour or two. Blackjack was my game, single deck blackjack, and I would either hold my own or make a modest living, but you could only do it for an hour or two. And so I spent my time going to shows. I saw Noel Coward, Mad Dogs and Englishmen. I saw Edith Piaf, the French singer who was phenomenal. Saw Joey Lewis, one of the country's greatest comedians. So I had more fun watching the shows. And then one day I quit gambling because I was no longer emotionally involved with the game. I felt like an out-of-body mathematician. I was divorced from it, and I totally quit. And I decided the thing that I loved were the shows that I watched, the movies I watched, and I went to Hollywood. So I got a number of odd jobs, and one of the jobs I got was sorting oranges at a place called Barley's Orange. You'd have to sort rotten oranges, and they would make marmalade, and they would make soda pop, and they would make jams, and it was close to a boarding house where I was at Hollywood Boulevard and La Brea. And every Sunday morning I would walk home after working the midnight shift. I wanted to work the midnight shift because I wanted to be available during the day to maybe audition as an actor or anything like that. Walking home, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and I just get to the outside of my boarding house, and this Cadillac convertible comes down La Brea on the other side of the street. Here's this nice-looking guy with a tan and a beautiful yellow shirt on, and as the car stops across the street and then literally backs up and moves over right next to me. And the guy says in this sort of English accent voice where I was coming from a party? And I told him, no, I was coming from work. And he said, where was I off to now? And I pointed to the house. I said, I'm going in there to get breakfast and go get some sleep. And he said, how would you like to have breakfast with me, young man? And I said, no, thanks. And I went in the house. When I opened the door, I remembered the sound of the voice. It was the greatest film opening ever. It was the Philadelphia Story with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And the guy in the car was Cary Grant. And I never said anything about that because who would believe it? You know, it was nonsense. And then a number of years later, I got a job in the mail room, and I delivered mail to Cary Grant and Sophie Loren. But you asked me about the deportation. I had been there about a year illegally. I was in a couple of theater groups, and I had this job. I don't know if you remember, but in the early 50s, McCarthyism was sweeping the country. Senator Joe McCarthy had destroyed thousands of lives, and in Hollywood they had the thing called the blacklist. And so people were terrified of being called a commie. And a number of people committed suicide, a number of people lost their jobs, and 10 people went to prison. One of them was Albert Maltz, whom I met later and did a draft of his book for Frank Sinatra and Pascal Wexler, which I'll get to later. But anyway, this accountant, a young man, about 28 years of age, and he had this better red than dead pin on his lapel. And he called himself a young Republican, so I'm joking. I'm saying that's the first time I ever heard those two words together, young Republican. Well, he hated me right away, and he also hated FDR. Franklin Roosevelt said was crippled by God because he was a commie, and he was given Eleanor Roosevelt as a wife, so he'd wake up to look at that ugly woman. I mean, he was a really vicious, cold young man. And I said to him, no, I didn't know much at all, just a couple of things that I'd read in books. And I must tell you, I was much better educated coming from Canada than I would have ever been coming from the United States. And I said, well, your grandfather, you mentioned collect Social Security. You better thank him, thank FDR for that. And I said, and I must tell you, it was Hoover, who was a Republican, who created that great Depression, and Roosevelt instituted the New Deal, from what they tell me, that saved capitalism from socialism. And I said, I go around town and I see Roosevelt High School, I see Roosevelt streets, I see Roosevelt golf courses. The only thing named after Hoover that I know of is a vacuum cleaner. Well, everybody at the table applauded and howled. 15 minutes later, the FBI was at the front door. He had called the FBI saying that there was this commie Canadian in the house. And I ran upstairs and I tried to jump out my bedroom window, but they had another FBI cop car waiting down below. So the FBI took me down to FBI headquarters. They fingerprinted me, and they found out after interviewing me, Jim, that I was no threat to the national security of the United States. I was only a threat to the store owners on Kingston Road in Toronto where I'd broken into often. So they turned me over to immigration. Immigration offered me what they call a voluntary departure. I was sent to a place called Terminal Island, which was just gorgeous. It was right on the harbor at San Pedro. It should have been a resort. It was so beautifully located. Anyway, it was $28, Jim, at the time to take the bus from Los Angeles to Toronto. I had not spoken to my mother in a couple of years. So I was embarrassed to ask anybody for any money, and I had no choice but to call collect and ask my mother for $28. Surprisingly, my mother took the call. But the only reason she took the call was to tell me how worthless I was. I was a bigger bastard than my father, and I deserved to be in jail and would probably spend the rest of my life in jail, and just hung up. That was the only reason she took the call. So I was there for about 5 months, and I thought, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to escape. So I planned an escape. We were on the 3rd floor, and the fellow next to me was Mexican, didn't speak much English, but he was in charge of once a week gathering up all the laundry, the dirty sheets and the towels and the pillowcases, and putting them in a huge canvas box that was on wheels, take it out into the hallway, and dump it down a chute 3 floors to the bottom. And I talked him into, I felt like Sid Caesar pantomiming how I needed to escape. And so he agreed to help me. So I planned it on a Wednesday because that was a very busy day there. There were no armed guards at the place, so it would have been an easy walk from the basement, 100 yards to the bus stop, or I could take the south gate and get to the ocean, and I would swim out to a ship. I would join the merchant navy. I wasn't going to stay locked up. So it was totally well planned. And the day that I was to do it, I was really surprised. A number of people came by and wished me luck. I thought, oh my God, everybody knows about it, but it was too late. So I got in under all the dirty clothes, and he dumped me down the chute. It was terrifying because I didn't know if there'd be anything for me to land on the concrete floor, but fortunately they had stacks and stacks of dirty clothes. So I run to the south door, and I'm going to open it, and it's locked. And then I go to the west door, which leads to the ocean, and it's locked. And I keep running back and forth, and I don't understand what's wrong. And I'm so tired, I sit down and I fall asleep on the clothes. And I'm awakened by a guard. He said, oh, look what we have here, a live body in the dirty clothes. What are you doing here? So I didn't lie. I said, I'm trying to escape. So he said, come with me. So he took me to the office, and there were three other immigration men in the office, officers, and they grilled me for an hour. They want to know who helped me. And I told them, listen, these guys are all Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. I did this on my own. I'm not responsible for this. So they said, well, you're going to get an extra 3 months because we don't deport people one at a time. We're going to wait for 100 Canadian geese to fly them north. And so you'll be here. You can figure you're going to be here almost nine months. So he's taking me back upstairs. And I turn to him and I say, you know what? Why is it Wednesday? Why is everything closed? And Jimmy started to laugh. He said, it's July 4th. It's America's premier holiday. So I decided then and there, if I ever come back to the United States, I better become a major in American history, which I did become, by the way, when I went to law libraries the second time I was deported when I was back in Toronto. So when I got back upstairs, my nickname with all the Spaniards was Julio Cuatro. Now, 30 years later, I have the #1 show that I created on American television. It's called Real People. We're getting a 50 share. Now, a 50 share means half of all the people watching television are watching our show. were getting 20,000 pieces of mail a week. And one of the pieces of mail was a letter from the guard who found me in the clothing. And he said, John, you have got to be the John Barbour that I pulled out of that dirty clothing. I'm telling my wife and my kids and everybody I know that you're the guy that I took out of that dirty clothing. Is it you? So I sent him back this really nice letter in an 8x10 glossy. And I said in the letter that thank God you wrote me because I thought about you often, and a couple of times I thought I'd look you up because if it hadn't been for you, I'd either be in the Merchant Navy or I'd be in jail instead of standing here on stage in a $600 suit with Sarah Purcell. So that's how that story ended.
We'll have more with John Barbour right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Barbour. John, why and how did you become a comic? In your book, you say Red Fox was your mentor, and you gave him his first TV appearance. How did that all work out?
Oh, that's really interesting. I became a comic. Hopefully you're old enough, Jim, to remember Jack Parr. Do you remember Jack Parr?
Yeah, he was before Johnny Carson.
That's right. Jack Parr was by far the best late-night talk show host ever, the originator of The Tonight Show. He would have intellectuals on like Gord Vidal and William Buckley. He had John Kennedy on. He found Mike Nichols and Elaine May. I don't know, Mike Nichols, you might know, became the great successful director, one of The Graduate. Elaine May became a successful screenwriter. The first time they appeared on the show, they were these intellectuals from Second City, but they were funny, and nobody laughed. And Jack Parr went down, scolded the audience, and said, these kids are funny, and they're going to come back until you laugh. And he did. They were back a half a dozen times before people started to laugh. That is something Johnny Carson would never do. But the thing that intrigued me, Jim, was that he had conversations with people. I didn't know that people talked to one another. I thought they either punched one another or they yelled at one another. And I thought, my God, I would love to be able to do that. But he opened his show doing a monologue. And his jokes were unbelievable. I remember when he had John Kennedy on, he said, you know, Senator, I never vote. And John Kennedy said, why? And Parr said it only encourages them, which is a really funny line, and I can remember it to this day. So I got all the joke books, I got all the recordings of successful comics, but I couldn't imitate a Mort Saul or a Shelley Berman or Jonathan Winters or any of those geniuses because they had their own style. And in the joke books that I read, the jokes were either lousy or if one was any good, it was something that everybody knew. So I decided I'd write my own jokes. And the very first joke I wrote was, I'm appearing here tonight through the courtesy of the NAACP. And, of course, in the 60s, everybody would giggle when I said that. And I said, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Canadian People. Well, then they would applaud. And I ended up doing an album called It's Tough to Be White, and Dick Gregory did the liner note. And I was one of only two people to ever appear on the Art Linkletter Talent Scout show. Art, as you know, was also a Canadian. I was the only one to appear a second time, and you can go to YouTube and Google that. Anyway, my second professional job was at the famed Hungry Eye, where I met my wife, Sarita, fantastic singer and tap dancer. And she was the band singer for a fellow named Earl Hines. Earl Hines had discovered Sarah Vaughan and Billy Eckstine and had been part of Louis Armstrong's Septet. But he didn't like Louis' lifestyle with drugs and women, so went to San Francisco, formed a big band, and my wife was the singer. And as such, she was close friends with Red Fox and Dick Gregory. And she said to me, when we met, she said, you should meet Red Fox. And I said, well, he's that guy that does the dirty jokes, the party record. She said, but he's funny, and he can be clean. So I went to see Red, and of course he was filthy, but he was funny. But when we were talking years later about Jim Garrison, who was the DA of New Orleans, who was investigating the John Kennedy murder, Red Fox, I said, you know, Garrison's a hero. And Red Fox said to me, heroes ain't born, they're cornered. And that's true because Jim Garrison was cornered by accidentally meeting Hale Dodds, a dissenting member of the Warren Commission, who said that Oswald never did it. And so that's when Jim Garrison got 3 sets of the Warren Commission and began to read it. In any event, do you remember Merv Griffin on the old Westinghouse show?
Very vaguely.
Well, he had the most successful talk show next to Jack Parr's Tonight Show. And he was signed by CBS to do a late-night show, and he called me and said, I've recommended you to Westinghouse as my replacement. So Westinghouse put me under contract, and I subbed for Merv, and I got great ratings because I would open the show doing a monologue, whereas Merv would open the show as a singer. He was Freddie Martin's band singer before he got that show. In any event, they used my ratings to get David Frost's money down because Westinghouse wanted David Frost, the Englishman, to host the show. So what happened is they signed David Frost, but a guy named Chuck Young at Metro Media Television called me and asked me if I would come to Los Angeles and do a 90-minute poor man's Tonight Show, the Johnny Carson show on a Saturday night, because they thought that Frost would bomb and I would be under contract to them when he bombed, and then I would become Merv's eventual replacement. So I did that. And one of the first person that I booked was Red Fox. And Red Fox got the biggest ad-lib laugh, they say, in the history of broadcasting. You remember the Jack Benny show when it was on radio?
Yep.
You probably remember this joke because it was the longest laugh they said ever heard in radio. Jack Benny was walking down the street and this gangster came up to him, Sheldon Leonard, who went on to become a successful producer, says, your money or your life. And there's a long pause. And Jack Benny doesn't answer. And he says, your money or your life? No answer. And the audience giggles. He says again, your money or your life? And Jack Benny says, I'm thinking. Well, it got a huge laugh because he had a reputation as a skinflint. Anyway, I have Red Fox on the show. Nobody wanted him on in management because they thought it was dirty. But I knew he could be funny because I knew his material. So when he came out and he sat down, at the time, Jim, we had the Black Power movement in this country and everybody marching and fighting for civil rights. So I asked him what he thought about the Black Power movement. And Red Fox says, I don't care about Black Power. I don't care about white power. I only care about green power. Because if you got the green, you can buy the places where the blacks and whites hold their meetings. And it got a really nice laugh. I ad-libbed this question, and I don't know why, and I don't know where it came from, but I was afraid I might embarrass Red because how do you answer the question? And I said to Red, why do you think money's colored green? Without missing a beat. He said, that's because Jews pick it before it gets ripe. The audience did not stop laughing for 15 minutes. And every time the laughter would die down, Jack Carter, who was a comic on the show, would take a $20 bill out and flash it around. And as a result of this show, he got a movie which led to Sanford and Son. And what a lot of people do not know is that Red Fox's real name is John Sanford. So when they took the show, it was an English show called Steptoe and Son. So when Norman Lear adapted it for Sanford and Son, they used Red Fox's real name, and he used his brother's name for his first name because his older brother, whom he loved, had died much earlier. So that's how that came about.
The title of your book, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, is a very catchy title. Where did you get it from?
Oh, my gosh, there again is another accident. I ended up hosting the very first morning news information show on ABC. Hopefully you and I will talk a little later about the difference in the media now, both in Canada and the United States. But in any event, when John Kennedy was shot, a company could only own 5 television or 5 radio stations or 5 newspapers. The worst president in American history, who was Bill Clinton, and this is not an opinion, this is a fact. He signed NAFTA, which sent all America's jobs overseas. He repealed Glass-Steagall, instituted by FDR, which would prevent Wall Street from gambling with people's money, which led to the recession in 2008, where I lost a $900,000 home and millions of people lost their homes and nobody went to prison. But worse, he signed the Communications Act in 1996 that turned 95% of all the media in America over to 6 monopolistic corporations, which should be disbanded. So in any event, Chicanos by the thousands were marching on the streets to challenge ABC's license in L.A. And in order to stop that, ABC decided, as a sop to the Federal Communications Commission and the Chicanos, they would institute a morning news show. People thought it would go to the most popular Mexican in L.A., a guy named Mario Machado. Wonderful, wonderful, talented man. And Mario said, no, the best guy to hire is John Barbour. They said, well, he's a comic. He said, yes, but, he does mostly political jokes. He said, I can only read, but John could ad-lib. And I auditioned against 40 people, and I got it. I put Muhammad Ali on the air for an hour when most Americans wanted him in jail or hanging from a tree because he wouldn't go to Vietnam and kill yellow people because he said he's only had problems with white people. I had Jane Fonda on when they called her Hanoi Jane. And when Cesar Chavez came to town to testify at a trial, he called me and asked if he could be on the show. Wonderful stories are in the books. Ronald Reagan, even when he was running for the governorship of California, called to be on the show. Great stories in the book. In any event, it was 1970 when I got the show. And it was a year after Jim Garrison had lost his case. He had arrested Clay Shaw in 1967. He announced to the press that he'd solved the crime, which he did. He said the CIA did it. We're going to prove it in court. Now, the federal government and the media called him a kook, and they stood in his way for 2 years. And I would say to my friends, I'm a street kid, and I know nothing about this, Jim. And I say, listen, if the government has nothing on the guy, why don't they get out of his way and let him fall face in a courtroom? And eventually got into court. It was January 29th, 1969, serendipity, the birthday of my son. He got Clay Shaw into court, and he lost the conspiracy case. But he won the perjury case. And Clay Shaw would have gone to prison for 99 years, but the government stepped in and prevented the prosecution. So now it's all over. And I'm thinking nothing about it. Why would I doubt my government? I mean, I believed in Frank Capra and Jimmy Stewart, and I wanted to be a citizen of this country with Thomas Jefferson as one of the founding fathers and Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, founded by intellectuals. A long way from what we have in government today, but that's what America was in the beginning. And I loved America's Beginnings. And that's why I kept coming back when I was kicked out. So I'm in a bookstore one day, and I pick up this book called Heritage of Stone, authored by Jim Garrison. I think, Jim, is that the same guy? So I pick it up to read it, and I read it standing for 4 hours in the bookstore. And I learned things I never knew, I never heard of. He had to take Time Life to the Supreme Court to get the Zapruder film. A doctor named Fink testified that there was never an autopsy. They were prevented by generals, probably Curtis LeMay, from performing the autopsy. All kinds of things that happened in the courtroom that we never read about. So I picked up the phone and I called the DA's office in New Orleans and asked for Jim Garrison. And this bass baritone answered the phone, and he identified himself as Mr. Garrison. And I got all excited. I said, Mr. Garrison, I just read Heritage of Stone, and I want to book you on my show. And he laughed. He said, oh, John, you must be the second one. I only sold 2 copies, which is not true. It became a bestseller. But he said, you'll never get away with it. They don't have me on television. They won't let me on in the media to tell my story. I said, well, I have the #1 show here. I've won an Emmy. I'm sure we're going to win another. And I told him of all the controversial people we had. So he agreed to come on. And we talked for a half an hour. And he said to me, John, do you know, it's 1970. And 6 years after the Warren Report, 83% of all Americans do not believe the Warren Report or that Oswald acted alone or did it at all. And I said, well, goodness, why isn't there more of an outrage about this? He said, well, the second question in the poll is this. And the second question was, would you like a further, deeper investigation into the murder of John Kennedy, where they investigate also the FBI and the CIA? And they said only 23% of Americans wanted that investigation conducted. And he said, what does that tell you about Americans? And I said, Mr. Garrison, what it says to me is I know what my mother and father did on the pool table or in the back alley or in the rumble seat of the car or in the bed to conceive me. But don't ever tell me my mother's not a virgin. And he howled. And he said, John, I'm going to quote you, and I'm also going to quote Mark Twain, my favorite American writer, who said, it's easier to fool people than to convince people that they have been fooled. And we've been fooled in America since November 22nd, 1963. And I didn't see Mr. Garrison for another 10 years. We talked twice on the phone. He called me after I was on The Tonight Show with Frank Sinatra because he loved one of the jokes. I made a joke about Watergate, saying that it was something that may have put America on the brink of democracy. And he called and asked if he could use that line. And then, of course, I tried to tell this story as a real people story once I had the #1 show in America. But thank you for asking that question, because when you said, I've only had 2 people upset over the title. Most people love the title, but a couple of people were upset at the title because it says your mother's not a virgin. Well, the truth is your mother is not a virgin, and it's a harsh reality to face. And in the book, you face some very harsh realities. Some of them are very funny, but you have to face them.
Is it true you were one of the first people to review movies on the news?
Yes, I was. I was the very first person to do that. As a matter of fact, that's what led to my meeting Sinatra. I was the film critic at KNBC. Oh, by the way, once I booked Mr. Garrison, I was fired the next day. He was canceled and I was fired. But I never thought, Jim, there was any kind of conspiracy to silence me. You know from your years on radio that it's show business. You're lucky. You've been doing this for a long, long time and probably at the same station for a long time. But, I figured, you don't get permanent jobs in show business, and I thought that was it. And I started doing film reviews on the morning show. LA Magazine saw me and hired me. I became their critic for 10 years, and then Tom Brokaw, who was the reporter at NBC, saw me and recommended me to NBC. So that's why they brought me to NBC in Los Angeles. But I was reviewing a movie called The Great Gatsby with Robert Redford. And Paramount Studios had made the film, and I gave it an extremely negative review, even though the president of Paramount Studios said it was going to enrich Paramount enormously because it was so successful, going to be so successful. First, at the time, Jim, a theater ticket cost $3. And the head of Paramount was so absolutely certain it was going to be a monster hit. He said he was going to double the price to $6, and that Paramount was going to be putting out Gatsby apparel. And all over town there were billboards heralding The Great Gatsby, and there were Gatsby parties in Bel Air and Beverly Hills. But the truth was, it was a monumentally boring film. And I was the only one to review it negatively. And at the end of my review, I said the only way Paramount will get $6 for this movie is if they charge $3 to get in and $3 to get out. Well, Time Magazine picked that up, and of course it was all over the place, and Gatsby rightfully bombed. Well, I got a call from George Slaughter, and they were doing a revival of Laugh-In. And George Slaughter was co-creator of Laugh-In. The actual creator was a guy named Digby Wolfe, a drunken English wit who was brilliant. And anyway, but George ended up owning the show, and the show was destroyed by George because Rowan and Martin became the stars and not George Slaughter, and ended up in court. And after 3 years, this wonderful show was totally destroyed, which he eventually did to real people. Anyway, George called me and asked me if he could buy my jokes. And I said, no, they're in the reviews. You can just go ahead and take them. And then I said to him, George, I have a better idea. You know, on Laugh-In, they never talk for more than 8 or 10 seconds. Why don't you let me come on as critic at large, which I am here at NBC. I'll write my own jokes, and I'll help you write the rest of the show. So he hired me. We introduced Robin Williams. That was his very first show. I mean, what a volcano of talent Robin Williams was, he and Jonathan Winters. And then I ended up writing the only material that Frank Sinatra agreed to do, and that's when Francis asked me to become his private writer.
When Sinatra hosted The Tonight Show, you were the first person he booked because he knew about your feud with Johnny Carson. Can you tell us what was behind that?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. I was booked. I was very successful on Merv Griffin's show as a stand-up. Also on Dean Martin's show as a stand-up. And the Carson people in Carson saw me, and so they invited me to come on a show, and I was booked on June the 8th, 1968. Does that date ring a bell?
Not thinking too fast, no.
That was the day they shot Robert Kennedy.
Oh, of course.
That's it. So I told Carson and his producer, I can't do the show, and you people shouldn't be doing the show either. I mean, my God, you know, if it were Jack Barr, he would either not have a show or he would spend the whole 9 minutes talking to the audience about what's wrong with America. The first they shoot John, and now they shoot his brother. What's going on? And I said, you should not do the show. So Carson said, if you don't do the show, you're never doing the show. Well, as you well know, from people like Steve Martin and Rodney Dangerfield later on, and Flip Wilson, if you did the Tonight Show and you were invited to sit next to the throne and sit next to the king, your career was made. And so I thought, gosh, but I can't do it. My stomach tells me I should not do it. Or if I do it, should I not do a monologue? Should I just walk down and tell the audience I can't do a monologue and just talk about my feelings about America? That's what I wanted to do. And against my better judgment, I decided to do the show. Of course, my monologue didn't do well. It was the only time I ever did not do well during a monologue. And I tried to get off stage, and Carson didn't want to be left alone, so he had me come and sit next to him. I could smell the booze. I knew he didn't want to do the show. I knew he was uncomfortable. And years later, when I ended up being a critic at KNBC, I told stories about Johnny Carson. And while he was number one doing the Tonight Show, so he grew to hate me. And so Sinatra knew, because when Red Fox would ever guest on the show, he would say to Carson, you know, you have Joey Bishop fill in for you, and you have Burt Reynolds fill in for you. You should have that critic, John Barbour, fill in for you. He's the best talk show host around. Of course, Carson would hear that, and he would go nuts, and he would put me down on the air. So Sinatra, more out of fun than anything, because he was not too fond of Carson himself, decided when he got the show, the first person he was going to book was to be myself. Now, here's a little sidebar story to that. Carol O'Connor was on the show. I forget who else was on the show. During the commercial breaks, the Doc Severin's orchestra was fabulous, and he played this great trumpet. And for the 3 minutes of the commercial break, they would play the great music. And so the audience would be listening to the music, and they'd be quiet. So the end of the segment with Carol O'Connor, and Sinatra says, we'll be right back with John Barbour, and they go to break. But there's no music. And when people are sitting not listening to music, they start to talk. And it became noisy. After 3 minutes, it was really noisy, and I was afraid to go out. But I couldn't. I was going to be introduced by Sinatra. And I was going to. So if you go to YouTube, you can Google the whole appearance and this wonderful introduction by Sinatra. And for the first 60 seconds I'm out there, it's very quiet. And now all of a sudden the 5 minutes that I had planned turns into 9 minutes. I got ovation after ovation. I got laughter after laughter. And it was a monster hit. And Sinatra had invited me after that to go on the road with him. And I told him I can't, because the thing that I love doing more than anything is being with my son, who was sort of the Caucasian Tiger Woods. And I love to take him to junior golf tournaments. And I said, you know, I never had a father, and I didn't want my son to be without a father. And Sinatra loved me more for turning him down. And we made a deal to do a documentary about his life, which is told in the book. But anyway, after the show, I go out in the hallway with my wife just to recover from the nerve-wracking joy of doing this, because when Sinatra did the show, it was like the Pope or the President had been in the studio. The electricity could have run the state of California. You never saw anybody with so much charisma, and the people around us. My wife and I are alone in the hallway, just sort of hugging one another and gasping, because my wife was afraid with all the talking I would have a hard time getting the audience. And the band leader came over to me, and he said, John, could I talk to you a minute? And I said, yes. He says, wonderful job, and I want to apologize. I said, why would you want to apologize? He said, because we got orders from Carson not to play during the break before you come on. So the next night I tune in to watch Carson. And Carson says in his monologue, did you see that critic John Barbour last night? He just stay in his critic's corner because he's not funny. And the audience applauded, but it was canned applause. So that night I do my review of Johnny Carson talking about me. And I said, now I'm going to tell you folks a story from one of the people who's been working with Carson for 18 years since he's been on the air. He told me that every day when he and the staff come to work, they have this big barrel in the corner that they all drop a quarter into. And the first person that Johnny Carson says hello to when he comes in late in the afternoon gets the contents of that barrel. The barrel is now up to $640,000.50. So that's how that ended. But strangely enough, and I don't know why, twice I ran into Carson after that in the dressing room when we were both being made up for a show. And he talked to me at some length about Jerry Lewis. And he did some really funny stuff about Jerry Lewis. And I said, why don't you do that in your act? And he says, I like being employed. And that ended there. That was a great question. Thank you for asking it.
In the book, you say after winning 5 Emmys, the only person to win them for both news and entertainment, you were considered unemployable, quit the business, and then a week later, you got Real People on the air. How did that all happen?
That's indeed true. I was 46 years of age, and because I had tried to book Jim Garrison on the show, and because I attacked movies, when I decided to quit as it was late 1979, I decided to quit as a film critic, I got a call from Neil Simon, because I had bombed Neil Simon's The Sunshine Boys, because instead of using the 2 original Jewish actors, Sam Levine and Jack Albertson, who starred in the play, he cast Walter Matthau and George Burns, who were god-awful in the movie. And I said that the next thing that, because the richest writer in the world was Neil Simon. I mean, even if Shakespeare got residuals, Neil would have been richer. And I said he could afford to make his own movies, and that thing he should write is a letter firing himself as a casting director. He should have hired Jack and Sam. He called me immediately, and he loved it. So we became very close friends. He did the liner notes to my second album. So when I decided to quit, he called and he said, John, you can't quit. Who's going to tell the emperors who make movies that they wear no clothing? And I said, Neil, I have just run out of entertaining or interesting ways to say it's a piece of shit. Well, he screamed, and so that's why I quit. Now, I couldn't get a job. I was 46 years of age, and I had the first pilot for Real People at ABC, and I wanted Richard Pryor to be my co-host. I was under contract to Danny Arnold to create it, through the auspices of my son's godfather, Chris Hayward, who actually put Barney Miller in the air. And he was the one that told Danny that John has this great idea for a Real People show. So they had passed on it. 6 other producers passed on it. I was out of the business. Nobody understood what I talked about when I said it's the entertainment of reality, where you don't need writers or actors to find the most interesting or entertaining people in the world. And I was standing in front of my bungalow, a little bungalow that I had, and he decided to quit. It was the most peaceful and the only peaceful day I ever had in my life since hiding in a boxcar, afraid of being murdered by one of my uncles. And I was at peace. I would get a job writing jokes, which I could do at home, and just spend all my time with my son. I walked into the house, and 4 hours later, I got a phone call from Digby Wolf. And Digby said, whatever happened to that thing you had at ABC about Real People? I said, they passed on it. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm a father now. I'm not in show business. He said, well, I have a contract at Westinghouse, and they know you, and they want me to develop original show. Would you like to come and see me and bring your scripts with you and the stories that you've shot? I shot The Stripper for God, and I shot The World's Unluckiest Man. Really hilarious stories. So I said, okay, I'll come and see you tomorrow. Well, Digby was busy. And while I was sitting in the hallway waiting for him, George Slaughter opened his office. They had offices in George's building. And George said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm waiting to see Digby. He wants to talk to me about a show. He said, come on in here. So I went in there. And he said, show me the stuff. So I showed him the videos, and he howled. I showed him the 5 scripts. He said, I have a contract with NBC to do 4 specials. They're called Country versus City. Country music versus city music, country jokes versus city jokes. And Freddie Silverman called and asked if I could do a show about Real People, because he heard Danny Arnold was trying to do one. I said, well, that was my show. He said, how would you like to come here and do the show? I said, are you kidding? No. And he said, you'll get $5,000 as a performer, you'll get $1,500 as a writer, and $1,500 as a creator of the show. And I said, I would like to be the producer of the show. He said, no, I don't want that. He said, because Danny Arnold might do it. I said, but it's only for 4 specials. He said, it doesn't matter. No, but you're going to get $8,000. And he said, that's a whole lot more than you're making now writing reviews for LA Magazine. So that's how we got Real People accidentally on the air. After the first show aired, it aired number 40 in the ratings, which is lousy. But we got 8,000 pieces of mail, more than the number 1 show. So Silverman gave us an order for 2 more specials. And before the 6th special aired, we got an order, not for 13 shows, Jim. We got an order for 26 shows. And a year later, we were number 1.
Would you consider Real People to be the first reality show on television?
It is the first reality show, and I was dubbed by the best film critic, TV critic in America, a guy named Gary Deeb, who worked for the Chicago Tribune. He once said, television is the only business in America where competition does not improve the product, which is so true. So when I was in Chicago for 2 weeks filling in on a morning show, I had him as a guest, talked to him about an idea I had for a Real People show. So he knew where it came from. And he dubbed me the godfather of reality television. Now, for that, Jim, I would take enormous bows. We were responsible. The story I did on a teacher in New Mexico who built a private memorial to his son killed 1 week in Vietnam. He built a memorial on a hilltop in New Mexico, played the major role in getting that unwanted wall that you now see in Washington, D.C. You know John Walsh, the guy who hosted America's Most Wanted?
Yes.
Well, they had kidnapped and decapitated his son in Florida from a mall. And he had gone around begging the police to coordinate a search for missing children. And they didn't. They were all separate entities. There was no cooperation between the FBI and local police. He was trying to get what they call the Missing Children's Act passed. I did his story, and 30 days later they passed the Missing Children's Act, and I have a letter from him thanking me, and also the Navajo Code Talkers. I got them a presidential citation. The only celebrity to ever be on the show was Ronald Reagan, giving a presidential citation to the Navajo Code Talkers. These were stories that I insisted on doing, because when we were getting a 50 share, and I came across an important story that had to be told, I would tell it. We did more meaningful material in 3 years of Real People than 60 Minutes did in 30 years.
After years of trying to tell Jim Garrison's story about JFK's murder, in 1992 you made the award-winning The Garrison Tapes, which Oliver Stone even said is the perfect companion piece to his film JFK. How did that come about?
Let me mention just briefly something about reality television. I would take bows for Real People. And as you can well remember, in those days, to get on television, you had to have a modicum of talent, you had to have a modicum of intelligence or a little bit of a personality or some kind of warmth or something. That would keep you out of television today. The only thing that you need to be a star in reality television today is an absence of shame. The programming is absolutely and totally despicable and unwatchable. I cannot find, honestly, anything on television that I could watch on a returning basis. Once in a while, I'll watch Doc Martin on PBS, or I'll watch golf, and of course I'm a hockey junkie, so I watch the NHL all the time. Now, with the Garrison thing that happened in 1992, I had tried to do a documentary about Jim Garrison. I kept getting shot down by it, and I'd given up on it. And then I read one day that Oliver Stone was making a movie called JFK based on Jim Garrison's book about on the trail of the assassins, which he bought from Garrison for $50,000 and 10% of the net profits. But as soon as he announced that, Project Mockingbird and the CIA, which had infiltrated everything in in American media, including especially the Washington Post, a guy named George Lardner Jr. every day started attacking Oliver Stone in a series of articles called Dallas in Wonderland. And they were daily attacks on him. And the guy never even read the script. Well, he read the script because a disgruntled researcher had sent it to Lardner at the Washington paper. But in any event, I called Oliver's office asking if he would like to be executive producer, because I had 3 hours of the actual Jim Garrison I'd interviewed in 1991. I was the only one to whom he told the story. After 10 years of losing the Clay Shaw trial, he only told the story to me, because I was the only one who really tried to get him on television to tell his story. And I had no place to put it, so I told the secretary I had these 3 hours. It's not Kevin Costner, but it's the real Jim Garrison. So she goes away and she comes back and she said, could you send the tapes over here? And I said, no, you send Oliver over here. I'm not sending the tapes out of the office. So I never heard from him again. And I decided I was going to do it by myself. And so what I did is I put up my house for sale, $900,000, because when Oliver started his career, and he did this great movie called Salvador with an actor by the name of Woods, really terrific film, he mortgaged his house. I figured I would mortgage the house too. And in the book, you will read the most amazing story, how accidentally 3 young Mormon trumpet players show up at the house. And the next day I have $200,000 in cash to make that documentary. And that's how that film came about. It's an unbelievable story in the book.
Could you tell us a bit about your personal life? Right now? I'm totally blessed and totally lucky because of all the things that have happened to me. As I said by accident, I have the most fabulous wife in the world. She is the only person I know who absolutely envies no one. She was as good a tap dancer as Ginger Rogers and sings like Ella Fitzgerald, and gave that all up just to be a wife and a mother. She gets up every morning at 5:30 or 6, just happy to be alive. She is my biggest fan, and without her there would have been no Real People, because when we made Chris Hayward the godfather of my son and he was working for Danny Arnold, that's how the contract came about, with Sarita talking to them about the show idea that I had. And I've met 3 geniuses in my life, Jim. Jim Garrison, Buckminster Fuller, the scientist who invented the geodesic dome, and my son Christopher. And my son Christopher would have been on the tour, but he couldn't putt. But he kept the journals. So about 11 years ago, he gave up trying to get on the tour. We spent 5 years. I wanted to be a caddy. I wanted to quit everything and just caddy and be a thief. But he went to Hollywood, and on his own he started as a gopher coffee, gopher donuts. And 2 years later was writing on CSI. A couple of years after that, he was the co-executive producer. And last year he finished as co-executive producer of Criminal Minds. And now he's under contract to Netflix, where he and his partner are doing an 8 to 10 part series, which will be shot in Spain next year. He's just absolutely phenomenal. If I had my wife's personality or my son's personality, I would be making a star today. But unfortunately, I have the personality that I have. But I am so lucky because I get to do the work that I love to do. I never did anything in my entire life for money. And when I was making money as a gambler, I quit because, as I said, I had no emotional involvement with it. And when I was making a lot of money at one time with Real People, I was making $30,000 an hour. So money is going into pension plans, and it's going into AFTRA, and it's going into the Writers Guild. And Jim, I never thought about that. And then when I turned 60, I get all these notes that saying, are you going to start taking out your money? I was stunned I even have it. And in spite of the fact that I lost the $900,000 home in 2008 because of Bill Clinton
along with others. Fortunately, I had enough to survive and move into an even better home. Not as big, it's half as big as that one. This one's only 3,500 square feet, but it's the loveliest house that I've ever lived in. So I am indeed enormously lucky.
Is America the same country now that it was when you became a citizen, its media and its politics?
Oh, absolutely not. And you must well know that, being in Canada and seeing what's happened to radio and television. Even in Canada, as I mentioned earlier, in this country when John Kennedy was president, they had what they called the Fairness Doctrine, and they had equal time. That meant, as a film critic or as a book reviewer, if you attack something too savagely, you could appeal to the station and get equal time. And that happened once with me with the movie Soylent Green. I'm the only one on record to have a producer demand equal time and have it ruled on by the Supreme Court of the United States when I hammered a movie called Soylent Green. And that existed. But when Jim Garrison accidentally got on NBC, and the reason was when he arrested Clay Shaw, a guy named Walter Sheridan, who was hired by the CIA and the FBI, and he was a producer at NBC, was ordered to go to New Orleans and destroy Garrison's case by bribing his key witness to take the witness to California out of Garrison's jurisdiction. And he offered the kid a job at $50,000 a year. And this is a kid that swore under oath that Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferrie were talking about triangulation in the shooting of John Kennedy. His name was Perry Raymond Russo. So when Sheridan said he was coming down to make the job offer legitimate, Garrison asked him if he would wear a wire. So he wore a wire. Here you have an NBC producer literally bribing the most important witness in the most important murder in American history. So Garrison brought charges against NBC. NBC should have lost their license, and the president of NBC and half of them should have been in prison, for God's sake. Instead, NBC gave Jim Garrison equal time. It wasn't. It was a half-hour late night, and you can Google it. And he goes on late night at 11:30, and he explains how and why it was impossible for Oswald to have killed John Kennedy and that the CIA did it. Well, the owners of the country look at that and said, we can't have this kind of truth floating around. So they killed the Fairness Doctrine and equal time. It no longer exists anymore. You cannot sue for equal time. If they slander you, you have to hire a lawyer. And, again, as I mentioned earlier, Bill Clinton signed the Communications Act. Now, I have to bring up the business of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the best thing about Donald Trump was that he was not Hillary Clinton, and that's why he really got elected. He also got elected because every major news network in America was supporting Hillary Clinton. But not the alternate media, not the social media. Most of them were supporting Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And sadly, Bernie Sanders folded his tent up and moved into Hillary Clinton's tent. So he's done and he's over with. The only one now who is talking against all these fake wars is Tulsi Gabbard. But they've excluded her from the debates, as they did Ralph Nader. When Ralph Nader was a real contender, they kept him out of the debates because he was anti-war, and he broke into the debates and they actually arrested him. Now, it was Donald Trump, strangely enough, who inspired me to make the second documentary with Garrison. It's called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. We have CIA documents and witnesses that irrefutably prove that the Central Intelligence Agency murdered John Kennedy. The House Select Committee concluded that there was a conspiracy to both kill Martin Luther King and John Kennedy, and they sent it over to the Justice Department where it's a cold case. And at the end of this film, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which gets no coverage in this country, but is a monster hit on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and see it for $2. Every person in the world should see that film to know what the American government is about since the coup d'etat on November 22nd, 1963, the murder of Robert Kennedy, the murder of Martin Luther King, and these perpetual fake wars. But anyway, it was strangely Donald Trump who inspired me to do that second documentary, because he kept talking about fake news. And I thought, God, that sounds so familiar. So I went back, Jim, and I looked at the 3 hours that I had of Garrison, and it was like it was Donald Trump talking about the news today. And so that's why I decided to make this unbelievable. It is absolutely the definitive film on the assassination of John Kennedy and the birth and purpose of fake news. Again, more material, which is in the book, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, and the subtitle is The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Media. Now, I have a lot of friends on Facebook who are strong Trump supporters, and I got a lot of people who hate them, and I'm neutral about the whole thing. All I know is that the most important thing, as Thomas Jefferson and John Kennedy said, for a democracy to survive is to have a free and open press, which we do not have to this day. But Donald Trump could change that if he just reversed Bill Clinton's Communications Act. And he deprived these 6 major corporations, all under contract to the federal government, all with military contracts, if they would deprive them of ownership, because it's a monopoly, and not let anybody in this country own more than 7 radio or television stations. Because at one time, when Kennedy was alive, 1,500 different people owned radio and television stations in America. Now it's only 6. So that's a big change. If he's reelected in 2020, which is entirely possible, maybe he will do that. Now, he has asked, and Congress was supposed to release all the CIA files, but the reason they're not releasing them, Jim, you know and I know, that if they release the FBI and the CIA files, you will see no blueprints on how they say we killed the son of a bitch, because they talk in code. The reason they have overruled Trump and not released them is because they have Garrison's files, and Garrison names names. And I had the 67 boxes of Garrison's files. So if you go to my site, www.johnbarbersworld.com, not only can you see the first release of those files, you can see the first film for nothing, and you'll get a link to my book and a link to the second film. So thanks for asking that question.
Is Trump good or bad for America?
Well, you know, that really is interest, because you know what it's all about? It's all about Trump. And do you know that before Trump became president, every one of the major cable news networks in this country was failing? They were losing audiences. They were losing audiences to social media. Since Donald Trump has become president, their ratings have tripled. So everything on the news is either pro-Trump or it's anti-Trump, and it's Trump, Trump, Trump. And if Donald Trump is not elected in 2020, I don't think it'll be over the fact that fake wars are still going on, or he hasn't built the wall yet, or he hasn't reversed the Communications Act yet. I think it'll be just because people are bored of hearing the name Trump. But the Democrats are not allowing somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who is anti-war, to speak. So those who are voting for anybody on the Democratic side won't have anybody to really oppose the deep state, which is perpetuating these fake wars. Iraq was a fake war. Vietnam was a fake war. And in the film, Garrison even says the war with Russia, the Cold War, was fake because Russia had lost 25 million people. So they were no threat to the United States. And what was the threat to the United States was peace.
It may seem a little silly, but do you still write jokes?
Yes, I do. I must tell you, I write them every day, and because when I did a very successful internet show for a few years, and I would do an opening like a stand-up, only there's no audience, and I would talk 2 or 3 minutes and write jokes about it, because I didn't want to forget what it was I was saying. So every day, if you go to my Facebook page, you will find a joke, or you will find kind of a humorous observation. And I wrote a bunch of them about this Jeffrey Epstein thing. One of the comments I made about it, I remember that I don't know if Russia has had any influence on American politics, but I wish they had some influence on the American prison system, because if Putin had sent Russian guards to the United States, Jeffrey Epstein would still be alive. And that if Israel had sent guards, Jeffrey Epstein would be in Tel Aviv sipping the martini. And then I said, Jeffrey Epstein, R.I.P., R.I.P., retired in Portugal. So if you go there, you can find these things. So that is my release for me.
It might be kind of strange to ask an author this, but what is it about your book you like the most?
Oh my gosh! You know what? There was a young lady who was 16 years of age. She and her sister used to ride a bicycle from Long Beach to Burbank to listen to my film reviews. She got into the business as a result of meeting me and became an executive at CBS, very successful. She retired 8 years ago and to Hawaii, so you know how successful she became. She was the first person to whom I sent a book, because we've been lifelong friends, because she wrote to me when she retired that she'll never forgive me for the writing that I did as a critic, because she fell in love with me, fell in love with my writing, and that's why she got into the business. She got into the business and met nothing but bastards, and that it was all my fault. But when I sent her the book, she said, John, Real People was the greatest television show ever. No question about it. Your Garrison tapes are the definitive films on the murder of John Kennedy. But your book is by far the best thing that you have ever done. The reason I like it so much, aside from the fact when I was a kid, and I mentioned to you I used to read the Gordon Sinclair stories, and read those stories. It was reading those stories and going to movies and hearing stories that kept me alive. Now that I'm older, Jim, it's a telling of stories that keeps me alive. And there's scores and scores of them, not just mine. But the most important thing to me is this. When you were growing up yourself, Jim, and when you were starting in radio, how many times did you hear, no, you can't do it?
I'm sure several.
I heard it every single day of my life. And it's more horrible when it's coming from your family. And then it's worse when it's coming from the people that you meet. And then when you get into this business, which is an absolute killer business, it's worse. I heard it all the time. And yet, look at the monstrous success that I have had. Here you have a kid who's arrested in Canada a number of times. As a matter of fact, I was told by the best immigration and the lawyer that because of those past arrests, I could never get permission to come into the United States. I made them reinterpret the law because I became an expert on the law, because I spent all my hours after my second deportation in the Toronto Law Libraries. And how does a guy with that background, who's broke when he's 46, end up creating the best, highest-rated television, most original show in America? How does he end up becoming chosen over Oliver Stone to be the Oswald for Jim Garrison, and then become the private writer to Frank Sinatra? All by accident. I couldn't have designed it, or I couldn't have planned all this. After being told I was a failure a million times. And so for me, the most important thing about the book is anybody who is having a tough time about anything in their life should pick up and read this book. And the other great thing about the book, there are no chapter titles. And I was inspired to do this by Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht was the highest paid screenwriter in history. He was a famous Chicago and New York columnist who wrote the play Front Page with Charles MacArthur. He became the first propagandist for the non-existent state of Israel, wrote the best book about anybody in show business called The Child of the Century. And he didn't write chapters. All of the pages were like he was writing a newspaper column. That's what my book is like, and I'm happy to say that my book will replace Ben Hecht's as the best book about anybody in show business. So let's say you're interested in The Gong Show. You were a fan of The Gong Show. I was the first person gonged as the first host of that show. You can open it, and there are 5 or 6 great, funny, informative pages on that show. And Lenny Bruce was one of my close friends and a great inspiration. And he wanted to spend, we didn't know it was his last few days. He wanted to spend his last few days talking to me. And I talk about it in the book. It's called Remembering Lenny Bruce. And Rodney Dangerfield, the behind-the-scenes stories of Rodney Dangerfield, Jerry Lewis, Bob Hope, things you will never hear anyplace else. You could open the book at these pages and have a phenomenal read, and you don't have to read about Johnny Barbour. But if you read about the introduction of my book is written by a guy named Donald Jeffries, who is a best-selling author of 5 books. One of them is a huge hit. It's Survival of the Richest, a really great book. And in the introduction, he says the greatest book in English literature is David Copperfield. And my book is reminiscent of David Copperfield. Only the business that I got into was show business, not the business that David Copperfield got into, which is a supreme compliment. So that's what I like most about the book. And every day I wake up to a good review. I've got no mainstream media attention in the United States. Maybe it's because I deal with Garrison and I deal with the assassination. I do not know why. You would think that anybody interested in the media at the New York Times and the Washington Post would be thrilled to read the background story of the guy that changed the face of American television, but they're not. But I get these great word-of-mouth reviews. Every review is a 5-star review. So it'll become a word-of-mouth success. And that pleases me enormously. And that's why I want to come to Canada and start in Vancouver. I want to be the prodigal son returns just to see what kind of reaction I get in the way of feedback from my fellow Canadians.
After you start off your tour September 22nd in Vancouver, where are you off to?
I'm off to Toronto. I've already been invited to be on the morning show in Toronto on CTV, which is just terrific. I'm going to do a 2-hour show with Richard Syrett, who does a wonderful show called The Conspiracy Show. Even though it's called The Conspiracy Show, it's still a wonderful show. And I have 2 interviews lined up already in Vancouver, and I'm hoping for a book signing at Monroe's in Victoria, so my sister can attend. And I think Margaret Atwood is there on the 27th, and so I hope I can get there on the 28th, the day after, and get her hangover crowd to help to look at my book instead of her.
John, thank you so much for being on the Goddard Report.
Oh, Jim, I can't thank you enough for having me. I just enjoyed enormous talking to you. And when I'm up there, I'd love to get in touch with you and take you to lunch or breakfast or dinner or something like that, because I really, really appreciate it. You were wonderful.
I've been speaking with John Barbour, author of the new book, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, and longtime producer, writer, talk show host in Hollywood. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated.